just want to welcome you to the Brown Bag series sponsored by the Department of History and the Kearney Public Library. The series is offered in partnership every the second Wednesday of selected months throughout the year. A schedule of the series is as well as information about other history department programs is available on our website, unk/academics/history. And before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to thank the Kearney Public Library for their continued support of the Brown Bag series going on 3 or 4 years now. And we have upcoming talks in March and April that I just kind of want to put on your radar. Vicky Sakurada-Shepler and then Dr. Catherine Biba from Hastings College will be speaking on March 2nd. Vicky Sakurada-Shepler from the Japanese Hall Museum in Gering will be discussing the history of Japanese Americans in Nebraska and her work preserving that heritage through the Japanese Hall Museum in Gering. And then Dr. Biba will be joining us on April 6th for her talk entitled Atomic Spinsters, and I'm excited to see what that is. And we're also excited to announce that the rescheduled launch of Dr. Torsten Homburger's new book, The Honor Dress of the Movement, A Cultural History of Hitler's Brown Shirt Uniform, 1920 from 1933 from University of Massachusetts Press, will be on February 23rd at 7 p.m. in this very room. So for those of you who were hoping to attend the earlier event, we will be sending out an announcement and a reminder for that. So our topic today is Death and Burial in Soviet Yugoslavia, the Politicization of Cemeteries and Ethnic Conflict in the Balkans. Our speaker is Dr. Carol Lilly, and Dr. Lilly is the Professor of History and Director of International Studies at UNK. She received her PhD in history at Yale in 1990 and joined UNK in 1992 teaching courses in Russian, Soviet, and Eastern European history. Her most recent publications include Death and Burial in Soviet Yugoslavia, the Politicization of Cemeteries and Ethnic Conflict in the Balkans, which will be forthcoming from Bloomsbury Press. Please save any questions for the end, but let us welcome Dr. Lilly.
Thank you. This is working? Yeah, okay. Thanks so much, Nathan, and to the Department of History and to the Kearney Public Library for these events, and I'm really honored to be here. Before I launch into this research of mine, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about how I got here. Why cemeteries? This is really my favorite picture, almost. So I wanted to start with it. And it's kind of, the question of what am I doing researching this topic sometimes strikes me, because I didn't start out here, right? I've been researching Yugoslavia for a long time, but not cemeteries. And I didn't grow up in a family that went to cemeteries. I grew up in Colorado. My dad's family was from California. My mother's family was from Florida. There were no cemeteries for us to go to. And so I'd never been to one, really. And my first funeral experience was not a particularly satisfying one. You might have seen this in the Kearney Hub article, so I apologize if I'm telling you a story you've already heard. But when my grandmother died, I went to this funeral, and I loved my grandmother. I'd lived with her all my life, but she was old. So I saw her, the visitation was a bit shocking because she had makeup on. And I had never seen her in makeup, and I was like, who is this person? So I thought, well, but when I go to the funeral, then it will be like this really emotional moment. And I'd only ever seen funerals on TV, right? And cemeteries, and there was this great scene in all of them where, they put the coffin into the ground, and then everybody throws a handful of dirt in, and then they bury it, and the emotions wave over you, and I was like, yes, I'm so ready for this. And it didn't happen. I bet you all know that, right? That doesn't happen in America, right? There was a little short service, and then they said, okay, goodbye now. And we left. And the coffin was, the casket, right, was still like hovering over the ground. And it's like, what are you doing? What are you going to do with her? Right? She's just left there. And we were supposed to go away and leave her just hanging there. There was no wave of emotions. There was no sense of closure. There was nothing. And wow, we don't handle this very well in this country. I was really disappointed. But I didn't think that much about it. The next time I had any experience with funerals or cemeteries was when I went to the former Yugoslavia, when I was doing research there. It was maybe 10 years later as a graduate student. And I was invited by a family I was spending time with to the Day of the Dead ceremony that they have there. And it was such a different experience. It was really so moving, partly because the graves there are family graves, and so each gravestone will have maybe 5 names on it, and so every one is history in and of itself. But also the ceremony it's such a communal event. You know, every family goes the day before, or several days before, and cleans up all the graves, and then everybody goes to the cemetery, and they all know each other because it's a neighborhood, and it's a village, and it's a community, and they hang out there all morning, just sort of chatting, visiting, and talking about dead relatives and people they know, and it was just beautiful. And I thought, wow, this is great. And then you go home and eat, right, a lot, which is also good. And so it was a really lovely event, and I thought, well, this is a much better way of handling our dead relatives. So after that, every time I went to Yugoslavia, I made it a point to try and go to cemeteries and visit them and just see what they were like, but still didn't think about it as research until the late 1980s, when some of my friends in the former Yugoslavia, but specifically Serbian friends and colleagues, started talking to me about grave desecrations there. This was when the country was starting to fall apart. And there was in the news constantly talk about waves and waves of purported desecrations of Serbian Orthodox graves and cemeteries by Muslim Albanians in a part of Yugoslavia that wanted to get out, and Kosovo. And the way that they talked about this to me was really shocking to me. It was like they talked about these desecrations constantly. First of all, they were absolutely obsessed with it. And they talked about them as if this was like the worst possible thing that anyone could do, the worst imaginable atrocity, worse than rape, worse than murder, worse than torture. Like, this is the worst thing anybody could do to anybody else. And I'm not saying it's not true, it's just I had never thought of it in that way. I was sort of stunned by it. So I started to think at that point about the idea of cemeteries and graves as sites of ethnic identity and conflict, and the idea of a research project. And then the next time, another time when I went, maybe 5 years later, I saw this grave, and I was like, okay, I'm in. This is it. I got to do this project. Because I couldn't really wrap my mind around who had put this picture on their son's grave, actually, right? And I look at it and go, what's this all about? And what kinds of identity are people putting on their graves? Right? So the idea of changing notions of what graves are about and what gravestones and identity is what really pulled me in. So I've been doing this research since 2011, so 10 years. In that time, I have had 3 deaths in my immediate family, my husband of 30 years and my parents. And I will say that I learned that American death and burial rituals have not actually improved much. They're still pretty atrocious. But thanks to the research I've done, I was in a much better position to deal with them. I mean, that's something I'd be happy to answer questions on if we have time. But about the research itself. When I went in, I had some sort of basic questions, which were, how did a communist country, a socialist country, how did its policies affect burial culture in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious country like Yugoslavia? What did the cemetery grave markers look like before? How did that change? How did they look later? When did that change happen? how did those changes take place, and then what happened when that communist country, Socialist Yugoslavia, ended, and when the country itself fell apart. And today we're only going to talk about that last question. Right? That's all we have time for. So what happens at the end? But to get there, you have to have a little bit of background information. So I assume that most of you probably know Yugoslavia was made up of many different nations and religious communities, but there was a really close correspondence between those two things. So Croats are almost all Catholics, Serbs are almost all Orthodox, and you also had Muslims, and then there were Jews, and there were Protestants, right? So you had a lot of different nations and ethnic groups and religions. Before the communists took over in 1945, their cemeteries were almost all segregated by religion. And they were mostly confessional religious cemeteries. But again, because of that correspondence between ethnicity and religion, they were ethno-religious cemeteries. So you had Catholic Croat cemeteries and Orthodox Serb cemeteries and Muslim cemeteries, right? And they were mostly run by the religious community. I assumed that when the communists came in, they would try to change that, right, in accordance with their own value system, so that they would want to secularize them, first of all, right, but also integrate them in some way in accordance with their attempts to create brotherhood and unity among the peoples of Yugoslavia. So this would mean also integrating the cemeteries. What I found was they didn't, actually, right, in short, not much anyway. And so by the end of the 1980s, cemeteries in Yugoslavia were pretty much as ethno-religiously segregated as they had been in the 1940s, which was a little bit disturbing, or surprising anyway. They did mostly secularize them, not completely, but mostly. They did make them more egalitarian, mainly through economic austerity and through limiting the choices that people had as to what kinds of monuments they could select. So there were some modest differences in style and size. They were certainly all allowed to choose the religious symbols that they wanted, but they were more discreet. But really what happened, and that's important for my research and what you get to hear about, is that the communist regime marked cemeteries as politicized spaces by the use of political symbols on grave markers. So we're used to thinking of grave markers as having religious symbols on them, and maybe some other kinds, but not usually political symbols, right? I mean, there are some exceptions, like the Freemasons will sometimes have their symbols on graves, and maybe some heralds now and then, and a few others. But you don't usually think of, like, political parties putting their symbols on, right? We don't have Democrats and Republicans. If we do this, we're in really big trouble, right? More trouble than we're already in, right? But that changed, actually. The Communist Party in the Soviet Union started putting political symbols on grave markers. They put the hammer and the sickle on first. And then they changed it to the five-pointed star, right? So members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would have a five-pointed star on the graves of Communist Party members. And at the same time, of course, any other political symbols were explicitly banned from cemeteries, as they were, of course, from any other space, right? There are no political symbols of any other kind anywhere. And in Yugoslavia, this was true too, right? Same basic idea. The stars were first on the graves of those who died fighting with the communists against the fascists in the Second World War. And over time, as more and more of these veterans died, their graves would have these five-pointed stars on them. But it was not just for the veterans, it was also anyone who belonged to the Communist Party or anyone who sympathized with the Communist Party or wanted to show their connection to the Communist Party. As you can see with the grave on the right, which is of a 2-year-old. Not really too likely that this child belonged to the party. Right? And there were several graves like this. Okay. So what this did was to set a precedent for grave markers and cemeteries as sites of political identity. And when communism begins to decline, then you begin, and instead you have the rise of nationalist ideologies in the former Yugoslavia. You begin to have an exchange of political symbols, right? Or at least the addition of nationalist political symbols on grave markers. And these are political symbols that, of course, had previously been explicitly banned in the former Yugoslavia. And they start to show up on grave markers in cemeteries. And the first ones were precisely in this place where we'll be talking about desecrations later, in Kosovo. The first ones were in the mid-1980s. It's this double-headed eagle. Here, look, I can use the pointer, it's so cool. On the grave marker from 1986, which is really quite early. But later on, you get more and more of these symbols of double-headed eagles, which is a 15th century Albanian symbol of Albanian national identity, right? So they show up more and more on Kosovar Albanian grave markers. And then, as you get into the Kosovar War of Independence in 1999, you begin to have other kinds of symbols. The grave marker on the right, that sort of weird shape, that's the shape of the map of Kosovo as it would be if it were independent from Serbia, right? As it indeed is now, right? So you have grave markers in the shape of maps, right? And then, of course, because most of these grave markers, not most, but quite a lot of the grave markers, probably most of them that have the nationalist symbols, are grave markers of soldiers who died. You get pictures of soldiers, right? Etchings in their camouflage with their machine guns. And this is a pretty amazing grave marker, actually. But it's not entirely unique. There are others like this also. So he was kind of a bodybuilder guy. The UCK on the top, right, that's for the, whoops, wrong one. Kosovo Liberation Army, right? That's what that is. Okay, so this happens first in Kosovo, early, and then much later. But then when you have the wars in Bosnia and Croatia, you begin to see nationalist symbols appearing on their grave markers also. In Croatia, there were two that were particularly prominent. The braided cross that you see here, which is really lovely. It's a 13th century Croatian national symbol, and it shows up a lot. And the other one, which is a little bit less obvious here, but I just really love this grave marker, is this one here, which is the checkerboard flag. And it's the Croatian national flag, which appears after Croatian independence in 1991. It shows up a lot, and it's really unfortunate because it was also the flag of the Croatian fascist Ustaša movement in the Second World War. So the Croats might like it, but everybody else feels like it's a really bad thing to put out there in the public, and especially on grave markers. But it's all over the place. Right. Along with other flags and military symbols and so on. So then on the Muslim graves in Bosnia, it's a little less obvious because they tend to have a more standard form, but here what you see are increasing use of Arabic and mostly from the Quran, and the fleur-de-lis symbol, which is the main symbol in the Bosnian war. Serbia is a little different yet. Actually, you would expect the Serbs, who were fairly strong nationalists, to have a lot of national symbols on their graves. They did not, which took me by surprise. There seemed to be a sense among Serbs that graves were actually private and should have no connection to the state. What they did instead was to use on their soldiers' graves enormous numbers of these really long and very sentimental epitaphs. And they actually have a connection back to a Serbian burial ritual, which is women's laments, which were made up. Okay, there's a word I've lost in a moment. but yeah, improvised, thank you. Improvised laments that were typical for Serbian burial rituals. So then they turned into epitaphs that they put, like this one, that they put on gravestones, which are really typical. So national symbols on graves were one form of politicization, but really the highest form came with grave desecrations. Now, when you think about grave desecrations, there are a lot of different forms it can take. You know, we tend to think of grave robbing, tomb robbing, Indiana Jones, Native American desecrations, right? Also just vandalism. But what I'm talking about specifically are really targeted desecrations of specific individuals or groups, which I refer to as desecrations as hate crimes. There's not been much research on this, surprisingly, although it has been going on for quite some time, but was really typical in the former Yugoslavia. The purpose of these desecrations clearly is to cause maximum pain to the group or the individual by attacking what they hold most dear. And it's been also very clearly associated with ethnic cleansing, right, where one group tries to drive another one out of territory and destroying everything that they love so that they have nothing to return to. So cemetery and grave desecrations is closely associated with general destruction of cultural heritage, right? So destruction of shrines and mosques and churches, but also libraries and bridges, right? General cultural heritage destruction. But cemeteries are really a slightly more intense form of this because it's so very personal, right? And it ensures that the people who have been driven out not only have nothing left to return to, but no one left to return to, no one to mourn and to come back for. Very often this kind of cultural destruction is associated specifically with war and with conflicts. But one of the things that I have seen is that the cemetery desecrations, they absolutely take place during war, but they often occur before the war also, sort of as like a canary in the coal mine event, sort of a lead up to the war, and then also following the war, indicating that the tensions and the hostilities are still remaining. In the case of Yugoslavia, the first real increase in these desecrations was precisely in the late 80s, when you began to see the countries starting to disintegrate. And the first place where we saw them, I mentioned already, was between the Kosovar Muslim Albanians and the Serbian Orthodox Church. And it was not too surprising in a way because where Serbia has a really strong national connection to its cultural heritage and a strong cult of the dead. And so it was a highly effective technique for any Albanians to use. Although again, we still don't know quite if the number of desecrations was as many as it was perceived, right? And that's something I want to get to next. In this panoply of described desecrations in the late 1980s, one of the most famous, and one that just got repeated in the news over and over again, was called the Christophedon incident. Christophedon means Holy Cross Day. And here's what happened. On July 4th and 5th of 1988, Serbian twin infant boys who died in childbirth were buried in the Kosovar town of Grace. 3 months later, and they were buried. 3 months later, on September 27th, which is Christophedon, their grandfather came to visit the grave. And he found it had been dug up, the bodies of the babies removed, dismembered, then hastily reburied, but there were still remnants of bone, diaper, and paper money strewn about the grave. The grandfather went to the police, this is the Albanian police in Kosovo, who immediately investigated the event and arrested 5 Albanian teenage boys between the ages of 11 and 15. The boys confessed immediately, said, yes, we did it, and we did it because we know, we've heard, that Serbs bury money with bodies, which is true. They do. They put money and other objects with the bodies. The boys were sentenced, 2 of them who were over 13 to 6 months of arrest, 6 months in prison that is, and the other 3 to house arrest. You know, even 30 years later, you sort of struggle to interpret an event so horrific and so awful. At the time, local Serbs in the area immediately gathered and began protesting the act. And within weeks, tens of thousands of Serbs came from all over the country to protest this desecration. And they were clearly describing it as a political attack on Serbs. And so among the quotations from those protests is the following. Kosovo is the new Golgotha, which has now lasted a full 8 years. Is there any other country where one can see such brutal persecution of people and such terror over the dead? What they clearly assumed was that the children had been inspired to this horrific act by their parents or other adults around them, or they knew exactly what they were doing. And there was no room in this interpretation for this desecration either as vandalism or even as grave robbing. And indeed, it is possible, and indeed, and very likely actually, that the teenagers had learned in their short lives that the Serbs were others and enemies of the Albanians. But it's a little harder for me, at least, to wrap my brain around the idea that they were committing what we would call a hate crime, or even less likely that they had devised a political act to drive the Serbs out of Kosovo. A colleague of mine in this field, Max Bergholz, has this theory that rather than ethnic conflict leading to violence, violence, often motivated by economic gain, creates and sustains ethnicization, which then leads to further conflict and violence. Now, in Kosovo, this is a little tricky because ethnic conflict and violence have coexisted for so very long that it's kind of a chicken and egg problem often. But this particular incident seems to fit really well Bergholz's theory. Right? Certainly, it shows the symbolic power of the dead over the living. Maybe those teenagers were really only after money to buy candy or cigarettes. They smoke over here. But in any case, their indifference to something that most civilizations consider sacred left their acts open to interpretation as a nationalist conspiracy. I went to Graze. I was in Kosovo on a research trip in May of 2019, and I went there with my Albanian translator, seeking a memorial plaque that I had read had been placed in memory of these twin infants in 1989. I thought, okay, well, I should go look for that. So my translator and I were driving around looking for the Orthodox cemetery in this town, and we couldn't find it. So we asked directions from a teenage Albanian boy, about the age of those who had committed this act, who sent us to the field of Serbs, using a pejorative term for Serbs. We still couldn't find it. We found some graffiti there, which is actually Chetnik graffiti, Serbian graffiti. Still couldn't find it, so we started knocking on doors. And we met a Serb police officer, super nice guy, really nice, who invited us in, gave us coffee, and we chatted for a while, and eventually I sort of gathered up my courage and asked him, so we heard about this event like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And he said, oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, it was really blown out of proportion. It was not that big it shouldn't have been that big a deal. But he said, yeah, I know about that plaque. I can take you there. So we got in the car and he drove us about a mile away to where it was. And that's it. I mean, it was just covered in grass and debris. It was almost impossible to see. And so the three of us are standing sort of off the side of a little road, digging around, trying to, uncover it enough so I could get a picture of it. I was hoping to see some of the words. I never did see any words on it. And while we're doing this, another car drives up and an Albanian guy jumps out and starts screaming at us, like basically to get the hell out of there. It was a little scary, I will say. Probably a lot scarier for the Serb police officer and for my Albanian translator because they understood what he was saying. Whereas I could sort of be the American who said, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm an American, and I'm just taking pictures here. And, but even so, I took my picture and we did get the hell out. Yeah, it was just, a clear recognition of how tense these feelings are still 30 years later. There have been other cases, documented cases of similar desecrations from that time period, and that a Serbian Orthodox bishop documented every single possible crime against the Serbian Orthodox Church that ever could have happened. And I went through them all trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. Some of them were absolutely real, for sure, and should never be minimized. But a lot of them were sort of hard to figure out, is this really desecration or not? And in a way, maybe it doesn't matter because perceptions matter, right? And by the time Yugoslavia fell apart, what was really clear was that people understood cemeteries and graves as sites of ethnic conflict, right? As tools that they could use for ethnic war. And they did, right? So during the war, there were desecrations, and quite a lot of them, especially in the war in Croatia and Bosnia. I don't have a lot of pictures of that because after the war, mostly they got cleaned up, right? So I have some documentation of it. It happened on all sides. Everybody was a victim, everybody was a perpetrator, right, in that. But here's the case. I went to the Orthodox cemetery of Gospic in Croatia. This was another area that saw violent Serb and Croat conflicts in the early 1990s. The cemetery grounds, as you can see there, are pretty well tended, right? Things looked pretty good, but there were just broken headstones and memorials all over the place. And the caretaker who was there explained to me that they only got repaired if their relatives were around to do it. And here's the reality. In 1991, the demographics of this region were 64% Croat and 31% Serb. In 2001, that number was 93% Croat and 5% Serb, right? So there weren't many Serbs left to repair these graves. Right? The broken ones were all graves. What he told me next was what really sort of got my attention. And he pointed to empty graves like these, right? These aren't broken, these are just empty. He said when the Serbs left, they dug up their relatives and took them with them, wherever they went, right? So this is when desecration works, right? When it helps achieve the goal of ethnic cleansing. Right. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, half of all Muslim cemeteries were damaged or destroyed, and many of them were also filled with landmines. The war in Bosnia-Herzegovina lasted 4 years with a lot of that kind of desecration. The one in Kosovo was much shorter, so there were not actually many desecrations, perhaps because it was shorter, by Serbs against Albanians. But after the war, when the Serbs were kicked out, not all of them, a lot of them, the Kosovo Albanians again took revenge, right, on Serbian Orthodox population and their religious heritage, including cemeteries. According to a 2010 survey of 392 Orthodox graveyards in Kosovo, 58% were in very bad or bad condition, and 33% in good or very good condition. Good meant mown grass, no garbage, no damage. Bad meant substantial vegetation, garbage, and damage to all or most markers. And here's what's really important here, is that nearly all of the cemeteries in good condition were in villages where Serbs still lived, and 82% of the ones in bad condition were in villages without Serbs in them. So again, I went to Kosovo in 2019. This is 20 years after the war, 10 years after that OSCE survey on the cemeteries. And it's essentially still exactly the same. Right, cemeteries in areas where Serbs lived were in pretty good shape. Those where there were no Serbs were still in terrible shape. Right? Pristina is the capital of Kosovo. The Muslim, so it has a Muslim cemetery, which is in great shape, of course. Then it has a separate cemetery for the non-Muslim population, so it included Catholics, Orthodox, and Jews. The Catholics and the Muslims have no problems at all. They get along great. Right? So the Catholic section was in excellent condition, pristine. The Jewish section was also in very bad condition, but the Jews were wiped out by the Nazis in the Second World War. There haven't been any Jews there since then, essentially. So it was still as it had been since 1945, essentially. The Orthodox section was a mixed bag, right? There were some Serbs in Pristina still, and their graves were in good condition. And the ones of the Serbs who left were just still lying there, broken, and entire sections of the cemetery were overgrown and impassable. And that was true in a whole lot of the cemeteries of Kosovo. None of that prepared me for what I saw, though, in the town of Peć, which is a town that experienced really extreme interethnic violence in Kosovo, both before, during, and after the war. Partly because that is where it is the location of the Serbian Patriarchate, right? The heartland of Serbian civilization is supposed to be in Kosovo, and Peć is sort of the main town. It's where the 13th century monastery is the Patriarchate of Peć, and the burial place of the Serb Patriarch. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's stunning, right? It's nestled in a little gorge, and it's a beautiful place for meditation. It's lovely. So we went there first. It was beautiful. And then we went and got our little GPS out and tried to find the Orthodox cemetery in the town of Peć. And we drove around, lost again for a while. But then when we thought, GPS said, you're here. And we looked, and it's like, what do you mean we're here? There's nothing over there. There's like some concrete walls. So we got out and tried to figure out where we were. There was an empty lot, some concrete, some wire walls, and then I realized, oh, that was the entrance to the cemetery. And it looked like it was locked up, so I thought, okay, we're not gonna get in. But then I walked around the back, and the gates, the fence was all broken, so I could get in. And that's what it looked like, only really much worse than this. It was just utterly devastated. There was trash and broken graves and demolished chapels and tree branches and debris and just broken and destroyed graves everywhere. This is clearly what they meant by a graveyard in very bad condition. And it wasn't, I kind of wanted to stay and look around more, but I just really had to get out And it wasn't just sad, which it was, but it was kind of scary. It was a scary place to be. And you couldn't look in any direction without imagining the pain that had been deliberately inflicted. And this is what a hate crime looks like. It's not my place, right, to try and draw any lines equating the evil that has been done between individuals of ethno-religious communities out of revenge or fear. How many rapes do count for a murder? Is cemetery desecration worse than murder? I don't know what to do with these kinds of questions. The idea of trying to find a balance between acts of violence committed by or against individuals, communities, and cultural heritages is incomprehensible to me. And my purpose in trying to draw attention to them is not to make these kinds of comparisons, or even worse, to further inflame hatred between these groups. But somehow it does seem like it's worthwhile asking why and under what conditions the bodies of the dead become cannon fodder in the wars of the living. So what happened next? I thought about this because I was talking to my daughter about what I should talk about, and I said, God, I hate to leave them with that. And she said, yeah. What happens next? Right. On this research trip, right, they were from 2011 to 2019. By then, every republic was a fully independent state with completely transformed political and economic cultures that were clearly reflected in their grave markers. And all of them were characterized by increasingly religious political cultures, right, which were most obvious on Croat Catholic graves, right, which now, besides just having a cross, they would have, you know, a crucifix and a virgin and angels and cupids and lots of figurines and candles and lanterns, right? But it wasn't just the Catholics, but you know, the Muslims also increasingly are having Arabic elements from inscriptions from the Quran and other elements as well. But even more striking than that, I would say, was the influence of global capitalism, right? And the monument industry had expanded considerably, and consumers had many more choices, and you had the rise of conspicuous consumption, which had resulted in the first picture that I showed you. Many enormous and ostentatious monuments that were designed to show the personality of individuals and what they cared about. Most of them were now of shiny black marble. Most of them were much larger. They had not just photos, but life-sized etchings in various attires and poses, surrounded by images and figurines of their most important possessions. The most extreme I saw was this one. This is Mehmed. He's clearly Muslim, but also very worldly. The plaques, this one says, right, here he's in his Muslim attire, but sunglasses. This is a Versace plate, and it says, I raised this monument to myself for my life. Okay. And this one says, here lies Mehmed, who left behind 10 children, 2 wives, and 33 grandchildren. And when I put on my glasses, I see naked women. Okay. Monuments like this have certainly elicited some negative reactions. But what you really see is that, you know, now freed from the constraints of communism and from any other social norms, they are displaying a new kind of individualism. I sometimes wonder about the people whose graves are next to them, right? But, you know, I'm trying to, I try not to be judgmental about it. It's certainly entertaining. All right. And then my last picture, and this is my other favorite, my favorite grave, maybe not my favorite picture, but certainly my favorite grave, is this one. And this grave is really exceptional for its family's display of inclusive mourning, in really stark contrast to the nationalist demands for exclusionary politics. It was designed and erected after the wars of Yugoslav dissolution as a sign probably of protest and nostalgia. It's a family marker. The word on the top, porodice, means family. Families, actually, not family, but families. It has 5 surnames across the top, 5 different surnames, Golubovic, Balaban, Jakumatovic, Dizar, and Jakovic, which it's always difficult to precisely interpret ethnic origins from names. You can kind of guess, but you can never be 100% sure unless you actually know them. Right? But they are presumably, they seem to indicate, they and the 9 individuals below them, would seem to indicate Serbian, Croatian, and Muslim heritage. But what's more indicative are the symbols on the side, which do clearly indicate Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim, and partisan, right, communist heritage. Right? And, you know, they were all born between 1918 and 1940. Only 2 of them were dead at this point, right? So this is a political statement, right, about the values of ethno-religious tolerance, right, and peace. And this, for me, is what the communist regime should have been trying to do, right? What they should have been aiming for. And it stands now as hope for the future from a family that had come from one failed state and is living in another that is still struggling. And that's what I have for you. Thank you. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
Can you tell us about your travels, how easy it was to get in and out of the country, or were you shuttled out to a little room and everything was searched? Or
Oh, no. I mean, I started studying in Yugoslavia in 1980. When was it? 80 anyway, right? 82. And even then, it was pretty easy. I mean, I had one advisor who didn't really want to give me access to the archives, but others did fairly quickly. Yugoslavia was always a kinder, gentler socialist country. So it was always, and the people were just always so nice and so lovely. It was one of the best places ever to do research. And even after the war, when Serbs in particular had reasons to not be particularly friendly to Americans, they were always friendly to me. They just always wanted to tell me their side of the story, which I didn't necessarily always want to hear in the detail that they wanted to give it to me. But nonetheless, I mean, everybody was always so nice to me. And all I ever had to do was say, I'm looking for, and usually they would say, oh, just give me 5 minutes, let me finish up what I'm doing and I'll take you there. And they would, right? They were extraordinarily helpful and kind and generous of their time. And I couldn't have done it without them. It was a lovely experience. I miss, yeah. I'm always looking forward to going back, basically. Yes?
Could you repeat again your information about your book? Did it come out? When it will come out? Or what?
Well, I have a book contract, but I don't have a publication date yet. So I'm hopeful for the next year, but it's not there yet. So I'm working on it. Thank you. Yes.
I just have a comment. In 1993, in July of that year, when Bill Clinton was threatening airstrikes in that country, I traveled by train on a Sunday afternoon from Thessalonica in Greece through Macedonia,
Wow.
Kosovo, on through to Bucharest. But the train was very crowded, because all these people from Serbia was in Macedonia buying consumer goods like gasoline, and they were storing it in like 2-liter bottles, and they were putting it up their sleeves and stuff. But first part of your address, you mentioned the hostility between the different tribes, and I sense that, and and I was asked by some Serbs, how I felt, what the American view was, and I said, well, we kind of think maybe the Serbs are kind of pretty aggressive, and they shouldn't take that well.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, it's really hard because the Serbs tend to always feel like they are the victims, right? Well, to be fair, every nation feels like it's the victim, right? And everybody thinks that they're doing the right thing. It's a little bit hard to, and the Serbs have certainly, some of those desecrations were real, right? But some of what happened to them was provoked, right? So the relations between the Serbs and the Albanians are so long-standing and so complex that it's very difficult to tease out in a short time. Some of the others are less so, but Serbian nationalism certainly provoked a lot of this, and a lot of it also was provoked by the media and by Serbian elites who were wanting to stay in power. Right? So the question always is, how come the propaganda works, right? And it does. So, yeah. Yes?
So my mother grew up in northern Greece, and I imagine a lot of the burial customs are very similar.
Yeah.
I think it would be beneficial for you to explain to them what a family burial means.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the most interesting things is, okay, so first of all, there's no such thing in most of Europe as a permanent grave site, right? So, whereas in America, where you have so much space, you get a grave site and you assume that the dead person's going to be there forever, right? But in places where there's not that much space, you lease a grave site, first of all, right? And then if you keep paying the lease, you have it for as long as you keep paying the lease. But if you don't pay the lease, then they take the bones out and put them somewhere else in a bone site, and they give the burial site to someone else. As for the family grave site, because they are buried in like a wooden box, which degrades, right? Which is what it's supposed to do, after all. And the body also then degrades, as it is supposed to do, after all. Then after a certain number of years, you can put another one in there too, right? So you have bodies buried on top of bodies, on top of bodies, on top of bodies. And so you'll have a grave marker that starts with, 1820 and ends with 2010, right? It has all of these names on it. One of the complications I actually found in my research was that I had thought I was going to be able to trace how the changing style of gravestones, but then people go and renovate them and say, well, we need a new gravestone, as you'll say. It's like, well, this is a brand new gravestone, but it starts with 1820, right? So you can't, and you don't know at what point they've done this, right? They could have done it in 1960 or in 1890. They just change gravestones randomly. I mean, of course they can do that. I mean, it's not like they shouldn't, but it sort of took me by surprise. But it is this sort of lovely historical monument, except that the monument may or may not be historical. And a whole lot of people changed their monuments as soon as capitalism came around, because they had many, what they thought were cooler options, right? I'm not convinced they're that much cooler. They're certainly shinier, and newer. But then the symbolism on them changes and is suddenly much more modern looking, right? But Yeah, so, and you know, it's a little bit hard sometimes to sort of wrap your mind around the fact that they're not permanent, but if there's no one left to pay the lease and to mourn the dead, then you have to make room, right, for those who are around. So it's just a different way of, and you know, we may come to that here eventually too, although cremation sort of, you know, also saves space. But many of these religions are not big on cremation. And Orthodoxy certainly has not accepted it yet, although it tolerates some of it. Muslims do not accept cremation, Jews don't accept cremation, at least in theory. Yes, hey, Rob.
Was there ever any state efforts to desecrate these graves, or was it just primarily ethnic enclaves that were carrying out?
Right. There were a few grave desecrations by communists right after the war, right, like in 1940s and 50s. And they were not, even then they weren't so much deliberate state efforts, but like the military would be sloppy and say, you know, we're gonna go through here and, you know, do our military exercise. Like, excuse me, that's a graveyard. And so, and this is stuff I would find in the archives. And then, you know, the committee that was responsible for mediating between religious communities in the state would say, you know, that the military is doing its exercises on an old Muslim graveyard. And then the state would say, yeah, we probably shouldn't do that. Maybe that wasn't such a great idea, right? But, so that kind of problem tended to cease by the end of the 1950s, but you know, in that immediate post-revolutionary period, there were some problems, and some early desecrations, probably also of Catholic cemeteries, because the communists and the Catholics really didn't like each other at all. So, but again, those were not official so much as revolutionary, but probably nobody ever got in trouble for them either. Right. So yeah, there were some. But most of it was between ethnicities, right, ethnic groups. And mostly, I will say, up until the war, it was mostly directed against the Serbian Orthodox. And it was either by Muslim Albanians or by Catholics. Not officially